Hello, and welcome to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my weird original fiction. The following story is part of the Edie Valley Project, linked to the playlist in the description below. Yes, you have to read them all. No, that is not a request.
I'm also equally excited for this episode, in a very different way than I was for Liar's Days. This one's fun. I finally get to drop some info. I'm excited. Okay. Also, just an FYI, this episode contains a lot of references to another story I wrote called Das Vidania. I'm assuming most of you have read Das Vidania, but if you haven't, Jack's entire backstory is in Das Vidania. I've tried to make this episode as friendly as possible for people who haven't read it, but this is kind of your cue that maybe you should check it out. There's a playlist on the channel. Just go click in. It's really easy to find. It's also on the podcast. Whatever's easier for you. But yeah, just an FYI, you might be missing a little bit of context if you haven't read Das Vidania. Anyway, here we go. This is Catching Up with Jack Steele. After Doug disposed of his victory prize, the atmosphere in the Smiling Goat grew friendlier. The rest were still a little skittish around Jack, especially after that last stunt he'd pulled, but Doug actually found that for himself, at least, the exact opposite was true. Of all the players at the table, it was Jack who had treated him like an equal instead of a kid. If he was honest, kid was preferable when compared to rock star God King, but the point still stood. They all had a drink or two and bullshitted a little about this and that before Tommy looked at the clock. Cindy and Nico should be back by now. I mean, they'll be fine. Cowell's with them, but I better go out and grab them before it gets too late. I think we should all call it a night anyway. Flora stood. I'll close up the bar, so Kuro, you can head home if you want. You sure? He asked, already straightening the chairs. She nodded, and after giving his wings a good shake, he grabbed his things and, with a begrudging farewell to the rest, headed out into the deepening dark. That's your cue, buddy. Flora then turned to Jack, who still hadn't moved.
Pleasure seeing you too, Flora.
He gave her one of his toothy grimace smiles before shrugging and standing as well. She sighed. I'd get out of town soon if you know what's good for you.
Alas, my business this time is more than just a simple catch-up, I'm afraid.
Flora looked somewhat exasperated. Just don't let Malachi's go and see you.
I'm appalled you would think so low of me.
Jack grabbed his coat and swept out the door, saluting lazily.
They'll be dead before they can even blink.
That's what I'm worried about, Flora said, more to herself than anything. After seeming to shake herself, she turned to Doug, who was still hovering around awkwardly. As much as he didn't want to be a bother, he knew that right on the other side of that door was a one-way ticket back to Bakke Junction. Hey, kid, she said, do you need a place to stay? There's rooms upstairs.
Nah, that's all right.
He waved her off.
I've got a place.
A place so big it was impossible to miss. Okay. She returned to her tidying, though she still sounded concerned. Just be careful on your way back, yeah? You never know who you're going to run into around here. He promised her he would and waved goodbye before following after the others. He really liked this place. And he liked Flora. He hoped he could come back the next time he managed to sneak away. After his evening here, Doug felt a hell of a lot better. The best he had felt in a pretty long time, in fact. It wouldn't last, but it was certainly better than if it hadn't happened at all. As the door closed behind him, Doug was hit with a surprisingly crisp night air. It was going to be okay. He still had a long walk between him and the clock tower. But before he got anywhere with that endeavor, he heard a small click from the darkness, and a flame lit up the face of the man holding a cigarette between his teeth as he leaned against the brick wall of the bar.
Loitering's illegal, you know,
Doug said sagely, and Jack grinned.
I haven't been the type to give a rat's ass about legality for a very long time. It's not Malachi's hit squad you should be worried about. It's Flora. Well, then I guess I'd better start walking.
Jack took a long drag of the cigarette and pushed off the wall. He took a step or two before looking back over his shoulder.
You know, you should probably follow your own advice, mate.
Doug wasn't sure if that was an invitation or not, but he took it as one as Jack waited for him to catch up, and the two set off in no particular direction.
You played a good game in there,
Jack said after flicking his cigarette butt aside.
I didn't see it at first, but you sort of remind me of someone. The way you played, that is. It was that look on your face, I think.
Is that why you decided to team up with me instead of Flora? Doug chuckled. Who is it?
I was a hangman, Doug.
Jack glanced over at him out of the corner of his eye, as if gauging his reaction.
There's only one bloke that employed hangmen around here.
That would be the guy who ordered the executions. Of course. Doug thought with a suddenly sinking heart. Bake. He looked down at the street. You worked for Bake.
I heard he was back in town.
Jack's tone was still casual, but this time Doug wasn't imagining things. There was definitely something probing in his words.
Funny, I thought, how he didn't swing around to see his old mate Jack. But I don't suppose you would know anything about that, would you?
Doug stayed silent. It dawned on him that he was probably about to die, wasn't he? He definitely would have if he said the wrong thing, at least. And who the hell knew what that could be for Mr. 13 Twos? Surprisingly, Jack started laughing, very quietly, under his breath.
You don't have to say anything. I decided to stop by my old chum's welcome back jamboree last night. I recognized you the instant I saw you at the pub. You're a dead ringer for the man, but you can't fool this nose.
Well, I guess you caught me. Doug could only sigh. So are we going quick and painless, or do you want to make me bleed first? Jack stopped walking, an odd expression momentarily passing over his features. Then he shook himself and leaned forward against a metal rail looking out onto the edge of the city a ways off.
If I'm honest, I was considering both, but ultimately, I decided against it.
Oh, good to know. Doug's heart did one singular somersault before he got a hold of himself. Yet somehow he knew that Jack was, for once, telling the truth. He wasn't going to kill him.
But why change your mind?
He followed Jack's lead, leaning back on the same bar. Even this far down, that damn clock tower loomed above everything, a dark blotch against the sky.
Dice, of course,
Jack admitted.
It was entertaining. It was almost like playing with him again. Just for a moment. There at the end.
Though Jack sounded as wistful as he could with the constant growl at the back of his throat, his words irritated Doug.
Great. I look like him, I act like him, might as well actually be the motherfucker. But you're not.
Those words caught Doug off guard.
Sorry, what?
He asked.
You're not him.
Jack shrugged.
You're not Bake. Now how I can tell? You're just a man. Bake was something else entirely, I think. That's why we got along so well. But that's not anything to be ashamed of. You shouldn't want to be anything else. Believe me, it's not all it's cracked up to be. Might be better for you to just stay plain old Doug in the long run.
There was a moment of silence as Doug savored those words.
You don't know how much of a relief it is to finally hear someone say that. Pressure getting to you, huh?
Jack asked.
Personally, I don't know how the hell the bloke handled it for all those years myself. Maybe that's why he finally skipped town. So we really did leave? Just like that?
Nodding, Jack absently rubbed some dirt off his cheek. At least, Doug hoped it was dirt.
Came right out of the blue. Said to me one day, well, Jack, looks like I might have to disappear for a while. Make sure the city doesn't fall too much to shit while I'm gone. And I never heard from him again.
He sighed.
But maybe it's for the best that he never comes back.
Without warning, he turned to look at Doug and changed the subject.
You seem like a good lad. Who got you wrapped up in all this?
Doug had no idea how to even begin describing her.
It wasn't that Kay woman, was it?
Or maybe he wouldn't have to.
You know Kay?
He responded instead.
Who doesn't?
Jack scoffed.
Only bit of pizzazz the new tea party's ever had.
Hold on a minute. That didn't gel with what Doug thought he knew. Wait, he said. That can't be right. Kay works for
Malachi? For a time, Jack clarified. They didn't necessarily see eye to eye. Think she reminded him too much of our old crew. He sent her off on a special assignment to find Barkay, but it was really just a glorified exile. I doubt he ever expected it to actually come back. But joke's on him, I guess, since she really found you. Great. So I'm even more of a fucking pawn than I thought. Good to know.
At least that explained how she had so many oddly specific connections in this town. Doug didn't like the fact that she hadn't told him any of this, but in her defense, she hadn't been lying, exactly. Maybe she had eventually planned to spill the beans. But who was he kidding? This was Kay. A strange, rumbling displeasure emerged from the back of Jack's throat.
That's what the whole thing's like now. All politics and such. Not like the old days. Back then, if you didn't like a motherfucker, you could just hang him and call the whole town to watch. And that was your job, huh?
Doug found himself a little queasy at the thought. He could imagine Jack's theatrical personality absolutely captivating a blood-hungry crowd.
Well, that wasn't all I did, of course,
Jack corrected.
I did all the nasty, necessary things that no beloved monarch should be seen doing.
So he wasn't just a hangman. He was a torturer, too, at the very least. State-sponsored murderer?
How do you even get a job like that?
Doug was dumbfounded, yet at the same time so morbidly curious. Jack had to think about that one for a minute.
Barkay had a way of converting problem children to his cause. I think because he was the biggest problem child there was. He understood us. Understood me better than I understand myself sometimes, I think. Most people of my disposition are born like this, you know? Or they get a nasty bump on the head along the way. But I'm not like them. I don't know if you'll believe me, but I've got a bloody teaching degree. I used to tutor kids.
Frankly, I don't think children should be let anywhere near you. He laughed again.
You'd be right about that. That's why I left, I think. You see, something nasty wormed its way into me head. Something that left me with these.
He pushed his coat sleeve up, only to reveal row upon row of erratic scars that crisscrossed all up and down his arm.
It was a wolf, you could say. And when it finally fucked off, it left bits of itself behind. Right up here.
He pointed to his head.
Can't stand the way my people kept looking at me. She was right to be scared, because every time I saw her, I kept imagining cutting her fingers off one knuckle at a time.
Dude, Doug muttered.
What?
Jack tilted his head, as if genuinely confused by the reaction.
I'm thinking about how fun it would be to eat your eyeballs right now, but you don't see me doing it, do you? Well, I suppose you won't be seeing it anyway.
His husky snickers sent shivers down Doug's spine.
But back then I had trouble keeping those impulses in check. I didn't want to hurt her. I wanted her to remember Jack Steele, her beloved tutor, not the thing inhabiting his corpse. So I left. Tore right through reality and just disappeared.
Wait, you can do that? Doug asked.
You can't, Jack said, but that wolf, the one that left itself behind, it could. It wasn't normal, so I'm not either, anymore. How do you think I've hung around waiting the last 50 years? I'm not a bloody demon.
Maybe that was a bit of the reason why even the demons were scared of him.
But I'm rambling,
Jack admitted.
You want to hear about how I joined the Tea Party?
Doug nodded.
Good.
Jack grinned.
That's a much more pleasant story anyway.
At the time, Jack wasn't in the best place. For a while, he had just wandered between realities, avoiding people as much as he could, only occasionally ripping a large animal apart with his bare hands. But it didn't help. It never did. It made him want to start cutting open his arms again, just to see blood. For so very long, that thing, the Volk, had filled his head with so many maddening atrocities. His mind was still filled with such madness. Except now it was worse. Because that wolf in his head, that voice that instructed him to kill, to rape, to destroy, now it was his own. It was only a matter of time, really, before he gave in to that voice. The sad part was that he'd been so frenzied by that sudden euphoric release that he didn't even remember what that kill had looked like. Jack had spent days afterwards racking his brain desperately, trying to preserve something of that life he'd snuffed out. But it was no good. It was gone. For a while, that had made the wolf quiet down. But only for a while. And so he continued to wander, trying to commit atrocities only when it became unbearable not to, only when it got to a point when he might cross an extra line, do something far worse if he didn't kill right now. And somewhere along the way, Jack Steele ceased to be. He lost him to the blood and madness, and the saddest part was that he barely even missed him. Ada had given her life to save not a man, but a miserable fucking dog. At some point, as most travelers did, he found his way to Discord, and he discovered something marvelous. Demons didn't die when they were killed. Oh no, unless you bound them with cold iron, they just fucked off to find another cocksucker to inhabit. He could kill with reckless abandon, and the sheer trauma he inflicted was usually enough to satiate the wolf. Discord was large, with many dark corners and abandoned warehouses to hide in. And so, for a time, he settled down. Got to know the brothels in the area very well for when the demon killing didn't quite cut it, though they always charged him extra, a mishandling fee they called it. Ridiculous. But still, even in a city as lawless as Discord, he couldn't stay anonymous forever. He began to hear whispers about his own exploits, and one of his victims returned to the city and squealed about him to the paper. Some clever clogs reporter had seen the opportunity and took it. The next day, the entire city had heard of the deeds of Laughing Jack. Of course, if they thought a little press was going to stop him, they'd been sadly mistaken. They could send manhunts after him all they wanted. The challenge just made it more fun. Like a game that he always won. And shut up, he'd only sent the one manifesto to the paper on a whim, though he had maybe picked too much of a fight with the Tea Party specifically, for that was likely how Bakke had gotten involved. It had been a particularly dark night, in one of the lowest alleys of the city, that they'd met for the first time. Jack was elbow deep down some poor fucker's throat, chuckling to himself. Now that he thought about it, that was probably why they'd given him that stupid nickname in the first place. But then he heard something unexpected. Someone cleared their throat, and very close by, at that. He paused in the middle of his cavity search. That couldn't have been right. For him to hear such a small noise, the source would have to be close enough that they could see exactly what he was doing. They should be running and screaming by now. Jack was just about to resume his work when he heard it again, louder and more pronounced this time. So he wormed his arm back up the demon's throat with a horribly moist noise and grabbed one of his knives. He didn't have to look long to find him. Despite the darkness of the streets, his white hair and curved horns almost seemed to glow. The man wiggled his fingers at Jack, a large, friendly smile spreading across his face, as if he was simply meeting a friend for a nice afternoon cup of tea. "I'd walk away if I were you, mate," Jack warned, bringing the blade of his knife up to eye level. "Just turn around nice and slow." "Sorry, can't do that," was the casual reply. "Not when I've just finally found what I've been out all night looking for." Jack straightened. Something about this bloke seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "Looking for me?" he asked. "What are you, a reporter? Detective, maybe?" Yeah, nope and nope." The strange man shook his head. "Just someone who can't back down from a challenge." "What do you mean by that?" "Well, you see," he pushed off of the brick wall he'd been leaning on and took a step into the alley. "When I wake up in the morning, have a nice shot of whiskey or something, I don't know, open up the paper, and the first goddamn thing I see is I've been called, and I quote, a cunt-sucking fuck whore, and that if I want one certain asshole terrorizing my city to fuck off, that I'd better personally do the honors. Well,
How could I not accept that invitation?
Ah. Jack paused for a moment. He might have really done it to himself this time. If this man was who he thought he was, well, he'd heard stories of the people who'd ended up on his bad side. Though, looking at him now, Jack couldn't help feeling a little disappointed. He'd been expecting a god, but here before him was just a sickly-looking stick man with an overly dramatic silhouette. He decided then that he wouldn't back down unless this fucker could prove his own reputation.
So you're Bake then, huh?
He asked.
That's right,
was the only reply.
Well, I'm waiting.
Jack grinned with a mouthful of teeth that were just a little too sharp.
See, I like it here. Great atmosphere for killing props for that. Little slice of heaven you got here. So if you want me gone, you're going to have to make me.
Bake didn't so much as flinch as Jack pressed his knife against the taller man's throat. He just sighed.
Okay,
he said simply, and before Jack could even so much as open his mouth, the street had given out from under him. He managed to cling onto the edge of a brick at the last second, and looking down, his breath caught in his throat as a great, black pit stretched out beneath him. Ah, so the rumors of the passages hidden under the city, the place where Bake sent you if death was too good for you. He guessed they must be true after all. He hadn't believed it before, but how could he not when he was seconds from falling into it? Not that he would survive the fall. Jack was immortal, but not invulnerable. Above him, Bake looked mildly amused as he watched him struggle.
You know,
he yawned,
I could just step on your fingers right now, and that'd be it for you. What do you want? A bloody apology? No, not at all.
Surprisingly, Bake reached a hand down to him, but Jack hesitated to take it. It was his eyes, he thought. They were too deep a green to be natural, and there was too much going on in them at once that Jack couldn't tell whether he was elated or furious. One thing was for sure. Looking at him now, that feeling of déjà vu only intensified.
Well, are you gonna take my hand, or are you just gonna keep staring lovingly into my eyes?
He asked, and the moment was broken. Jack grasped his hand, and with a bit of effort, managed to clamber upwards. Yet just before he gained solid footing, his shoe just balancing on the edge of the bricks, a smile broke out on Bake's face, and he let go. Imagine Jack's surprise when instead of falling down into a dark abyss filled with who knew what, he fell on his ass back down on the pavement. He jumped up and away, but when he looked back, he was stunned to discover the street whole and unblemished, as if the hole had never been there in the first place. Bake proved to be no help, as his expression remained too intense to actually parse what he was really thinking. Frankly, he found, he didn't really care. He was suddenly filled with the intense desire to get away.
All right,
he grunted, still catching his breath. I guess I'll fuck off then. Hold on. Bake stepped in front of him, though Jack was unsure if he'd actually seen him move.
You didn't think I'd really come out here just to get rid of you? Yes. What other reason is there? Because I think we can be friends.
For some reason, the grin on Bake's face sent shivers down Jack's spine.
See, the thing is, as fucking nasty as it is, you're really good at what you do. I can tell. And sometimes, when you're in charge of a whole goddamn reality, you have to do some fucking nasty things. But you see, I don't really have the stomach for it.
He said that too lightly to be telling the truth.
So I always try to have a guy who does. A hangman, I guess, is the formal title. You really love to hear yourself talk, huh?
Jack interrupted.
Were you planning on getting to the point anytime soon? Until recently, I had a guy. He continued as if Jack hadn't said anything at all. But as it turns out, he doesn't listen to directions very well. So you can see how that puts me in a bit of a pickle. I need someone to hang my hangman. And let me guess. You want me to do it? Well, it's either that or the next time I see you, I'm gonna enjoy stepping on your fingers. So, if I have this right,
Jack tilted his head,
You need someone to do all the nasty business that you can't be seen doing. And you thought the best man for the job is the same bloke who's been terrorizing your city for the last month. Well, yeah, kills two birds with one stone, doesn't it? You get to kill people or otherwise maim them in whatever slow, gruesome way your little heart desires, and I get someone to kill the people I don't want to.
Jack just laughed, long and hard. Yet the entire time, Bake's expression didn't change, like he already knew exactly what he was going to say.
So do you want a fucking resume or something? Nah, nothing like that.
Bake shook his head.
Just a handshake, and the job is yours.
Jack paused, however, as Bake held out his left hand.
I always shake with my left, he explained when he saw Jack's confusion. Means I'm not actually held to anything I agree to. Then why would anyone ever shake with you? 'Cause if they don't, well, that's where you come in, isn't it?
This man, God, whatever he was not to be trusted. That much was clear. But there was something about him, something that made you want to see where the hell he was going with all of this. So Jack smiled, and despite the inherent lunacy of it all, grasped his left hand with his own.
So, now that that's all settled, I've just got one question for you.
Bake's grin matched his own.
Why do I get the feeling we've met somewhere before?